They won't. This is democracy. For anybody who's still not really caught up with all of this, this is democracy. Democracy, the will of the people, etc., etc., is just a arms race to see who can propagandize the masses more effectively.
And if the state, well, literally sides with you in terms of what if we just promote love and nothing bad ever happens.
Because water is important. But anyway, Based Harry, props to him for applying on Twitter. Now, he did post a really cool retro pic of the famous Hans Hermann Hoppe saying democracy is gay, which I was going to use in this video until stupid Twitter suspended my account because I referenced a certain piece of equipment during the French Revolution in conjunction with a modern-day ideology. And apparently, this is verboten. But anyway, he makes an interesting point, though, about democracy, power of the people being a complete farce, and all it really does boil down to is who can propagandize best and therefore manage the plebs most effectively. Essentially, democracy is nothing but a sophisticated piece of propaganda designed to induce a feeling of power, and yes, I imagine for the great many I am preaching to the choir here. But it does coincide really well with this piece that I was watching with Curtis Yarvin, aka Menches Molbug, debating, I use that term extremely loosely, Ben Burgess, who is by all accounts the personification of a Reddit user, just utterly delusional, trapped in a narrative so thick any semblance of objective reality outside of his minuscule worldview trying to permeate his mind is met with game-breaking stupidity. Actually, hang on, I'll show you. One sec.
Do I think that people have a right to safety? Yeah, absolutely. Do I think that having a harsher regime of policing is a particularly effective way of enforcing that? I think if you compare different cities in the U.S. With different levels, different criminal justice policies, I'm not convinced of that. But hey, you know where you're really safe on the streets? Norway, Sweden, Finland, places like that, which have vastly more lenient, more humane, more minimalistic criminal justice systems.
What else is the difference between Chicago and Norway?
I think the difference that actually matters, you can tell yourself a just so story about culture or race that doesn't really make any sense, but I think the difference that's actually relevant is the reason that they can have a vastly more humane and minimalistic criminal justice system. Anders Breivik is getting out of prison eventually, and while he's still in, it's much nicer than American prisons. And they can also have a much lower rate of street violence, is that social democracy works. That having a big, expansive welfare state, regulatory state, tied to strong unions, with much more egalitarian social consequences, results in much less crime, even with a vastly more lenient criminal justice system, which I do think is a win for democracy.
Can you imagine how deeply indoctrinated and decoupled from reality you would have to be to think race and culture plays no factor in crime stats? Heaven's sakes, these are things touted in America by Americans as primary factors for their crime rates in the United States, let alone trying to compare a city to a largely white homogenized nation state. And don't even get me started on IQ. Here's a wacky hypothetical. Suppose you took, say, the population of Norway and put them in Chicago, and Chicago in Norway. I imagine Chicago's heavy-handed police methodology might drop drastically. Meanwhile, Norway's otherwise lenient policies will not be so lenient anymore due to the inevitably massive surge of violent crime, and so
nobody wants to go there because there's a bunch of niggas killing everybody.
Thank you, Kevin. The propaganda spewed by the cult of social democracy is just... it is deeply depressing to me that it has any effect whatsoever. It blows my mind that anyone can listen to this bullshit and not instantly laugh at the absurdity. My sort of go-to conclusion has become that society is either so stupid or so intellectually insecure that when they hear something they don't understand or someone holds a higher educational rank, that voice must be respected or held in a higher regard than themselves, instead of running the H.L. Mencken quote through their head, that it's the classical fallacy of our time that a moron run through the university and decorated with a PhD will thereby cease to be a moron, and have the intellectual confidence to stand their ground, point and laugh, and simply denounce this kind of vapid stupidity as nothing short of moronic. I can't even fathom how warped your mind has to be to think the reason for every ill of the world is the lack of management in each nation state, which sounds rather elitist come to think of it, and if only we had more social democracy, we would bring about an improvement, as if this mythical power of the people is a universal core concept of man, that people would care enough to get invested in politics, be smart enough to understand it all. Oh, and also, politicians and people placed in positions of power will always do the bidding of the people because the masses know what's best for them. How fucking stupid do you have to be to believe any of that? We don't even have this in the countries that fucking advocate for democracy, for heaven's sakes. These people are insane. These people are deluded. And just to bring the propaganda back into a different lens, public opinion. I happen to agree with Curtis. I think public opinion is an effect, not a cause, and you can manufacture consent for, well, just about anything, really. The example he gives is gay marriage, which many politicians initially opposed, including St. Barry. Why? Because majority of public opinion opposed it at the time. Kind of reminds me of what I said before about politicians shifting their positions. In our society, we consider this sleazy and dishonest, a politician who will say anything to get and or stay in power. But anyone who examines that for more than 30 seconds will realize that is not a bug of democracy, that is in fact a feature. If people's opinions can change over time through some magical reason, definitely not through academia or media at all, should it not stand to reason that the representatives of the people must therefore change their positions as well? Does it not seem a bit odd to allow the people to change their views but not the politicians representing them? I'm no fan of representative democracy over here, but you are putting politicians between a rock and a hard place and then lumping them with stones after they change their tune based on public opinion. Hence why Curtis said those who control the levers of public opinion control the thoughts of the regime. And you can see this play out in action with how the regime presents polling. If they have majority approval for something, they will tout the poll as justification for it, as if the people answering these polls pondered on it for ages or even know the potentially disastrous ramifications of these things they are yaying or naying. And if they lack approval, they will just say, well, we must stand up for the minority, whatever the hell that means. Or they will tout polling for position X in, say, 2003, and then a higher polling approval for position X in, say, 2012, and use this as an indication of this mythical progress they love to tout. No one ever pauses to go, who did they poll in 2003 and what was asked, and who did they poll in 2012? I would love to know who they originally polled on gay marriage who said no, and who they then polled later on and said yes, because I can guarantee you it is not the same people. I would very much like to know the position of those who originally said no. Would they still say no? And those who later changed and said yes, why did they change? Because interestingly, as Douglas Murray pointed out recently on Piers Morgan's show, and I did see the poll sites, that over the last 2 years, support for same-sex marriage has in fact declined. Not only has it declined, but interestingly, it has in fact declined strongest amongst Democrats. Curious, I wonder why. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with children or the schooling system. No, of course not, but let's end this with something a bit more risky, shall we? Ben does mention something about unions protecting freedom of speech. Not gonna lie, I have no idea how the hell he got to that conclusion, but anyway, Curtis points to Tocqueville saying democratic America in the 1830s has the least free speech because the perspectives you were allowed to express in comparison to, say, France in 1770 was wildly more narrow. Very thought-provoking perspective, and I happen to agree. Lenin points to this as well in Liberty or Equality, that monarchy is rule from above, and as such, it doesn't exercise this horizontal pressure. It's by its nature more liberal than democracies, because monarchs cannot instantly refer to mandates received from the people. Their radius of action is psychologically far more limited than that of democratic leaders. Take early 1900s America, for example. American progressives passed the Volstead Act and enacted prohibition. Can you imagine any monarch being insane enough to ban the sale and production of alcohol? Never in a million years! Or to quote directly from the book, since in a monarchy the societal enforcement of the common framework of reference in the ideological sphere is not necessary, the controlling forces of society can be relaxed. Freedom of opinion and self-expression thus becomes more likely, and if granted, it will not be as destructive as in a purely parliamentary state. There is, for instance, little doubt that the professors and the students of the University of Vienna enjoyed greater liberties under Francis Joseph than, let us say, their colleagues do at present in the average American university or college. We live in this very tiny post-Second World War thought bubble where we think the event happened only a few days ago and free speech was this great weapon that defeated and halts the progress of the resurgence of those regimes, which is patently absurd for a great number of reasons. We sort of think of free speech merely in terms of criticism of the state, not so much in terms of political factions, which are more visibly decentralized, but in essence wields far more power. To quote Tacitus, if you would know who controls you, see who you may not criticize. And in our society, there's two groups that you may not criticize, one of which just so happens to be the nemesis of the villains of the Second World War, that for some reason you are instantly labeled as if you express any dissatisfaction with the increasingly unholy democratic illusion. Curious, isn't it?